The documentaries, fictional stories, and poems on this channel contain mature themes including psychological horror, violence, death, self-harm, mental health crises, and other disturbing subject matter. If you're sensitive to dark content, this may not be for you. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Hi there, dark entities. I am the Howlerist. Tonight, I bring you a story of a life that was never really yours. A story about inheritance, about the price of existence, about the things that watch you breathe while you sleep, patiently waiting to collect what they are owed. If you like to feel the crawl of something beneath you, why not subscribe? Join the pack. In the meantime, let me introduce you to something that has been waiting for you since before you drew your first breath. Chapter 1. Arrival. Nell turned off the highway onto the gravel road. Half a kilometer of it cut through dead winter fields before the property revealed itself behind a stand of bare oaks. The house sat low against the gray sky, fibro sheeting gone the color of old teeth. Something about its proportions seemed wrong in a way she couldn't name. The porch sagged on the left side. 2 windows on the upper floor caught the weak afternoon light and held it. She parked behind her grandmother's car, which was covered in a fine layer of grit from sitting idle for weeks. The solicitor had sent her the keys by registered mail, along with a letter that read, in part, that she was the sole beneficiary of the estate of Agatha Wren, deceased. The property and its contents were now hers to dispose of, as she saw fit. Nell had read the letter twice before booking a flight from her home in Melbourne to Hobart. She hadn't seen Agatha in 11 years. Hadn't spoken to her in 6. There were reasons for that, most of them to do with Nell's mother, Sarah, who had died when Nell was 14. Her death had left behind a silence so large it swallowed every relationship that tried to exist inside it. Agatha had called for a while after the funeral, then less, then not at all. Nell hadn't reached out either. Grief had made them strangers, and time had made the strangeness permanent. The front door opened with a sound like a long exhalation. Inside, the air was thick and stale and underlaid with something else. Damp earth, root systems, the particular smell of an old house that has been locked up for too long. She set her bag down in the hallway and stood still, letting her eyes adjust. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern, roses that had browned and curled at the edges, where moisture had crept in. Coats still hung on the rack by the door. Agatha's boots sat beneath them, caked with dried mud, as if the old woman had just come in from the fields. Nell moved through the ground floor room by room, opening curtains. The kitchen was clean but dated. The appliances a pale avocado green. The lino lifting at the seams. A calendar on the wall showed the month Agatha had died. Someone had drawn a small circle around the 14th. In the lounge room, bookshelves lined 2 walls, stuffed with paperbacks, journals, and odd volumes with no titles on their spines. The furniture was heavy, dark wood. Above the fireplace hung a framed photograph of a woman Nell didn't recognize, dark-haired sharp-featured, standing in front of the house in what looked like the 1940s. Not Agatha, someone older. It was at the back of the house that Nell found the first thing she couldn't explain. The door to the basement was in the kitchen, set into the wall behind the pantry. It was padlocked, and around the padlock, scratched deep into the wood of the door, the frame, and the surrounding wall, were symbols. Dozens of them, overlapping, carved with something sharp and gone over again and again until the grooves were smooth. They weren't letters. They weren't any script she recognized. They covered every surface of the door from handle to floor. She touched one of them and pulled her hand back. The wood was warm. That first night, she slept in Agatha's bedroom upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. The ticking of wood contracting in the cold. The soft percussion of something dripping in a room she hadn't found yet. Wind moved across the roof, and the whole structure seemed to breathe with it. Nell closed her eyes and tried to think about what she needed to do. Contact an estate agent. Arrange for the contents to be cleared. Get the place valued. Sell it. Go home. A checklist. Something solid. She dreamed about her mother. This wasn't unusual. Sarah Wren had been dead for 17 years and still appeared in Nell's sleep with a regularity that bordered on visitation. But this dream was different. Sarah was standing in the kitchen in front of the basement door trying to speak. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide, and she kept pointing desperately at the basement door. Behind her, at the far end of the kitchen, the two windows sat side by side above the sink. Through the left window, pale morning light fell across the bench and the floor. The right window was black. Not dark, the way a window is dark at night. Black, the way nothing is black. Total, depthless. A rectangle of absolute void set into the wall like a wound. Nell woke with her heart slamming and the taste of copper on her tongue. The bedroom was freezing. Her breath hung in pale clouds. When she put her hand on the wall beside the bed, the plaster was so cold it burned. She pulled the blankets tighter, laying there until gray light bled through the curtains. She did not sleep again. Chapter 2. The Journals. She found the journals on the second day. They were in a box at the back of Agatha's wardrobe, behind heavy coats that smelled of lavender and camphor. 7 of them, cloth-bound, in varying states of decay. The oldest was so fragile, the pages crumbled at the edges when Nell opened it. Agatha's handwriting was small and precise in the early volumes, becoming looser and more erratic as the years progressed. The final journal was barely legible, the letters lurching across the page like the writing of someone whose hands had stopped obeying them. Nell took them downstairs, spreading them on the kitchen table, then began to read. She didn't move for hours, except to turn pages. The tea she made went cold beside her. Outside, the night was falling and the kitchen darkened around her, but she only reached for the light switch after struggling to see the writing in the growing dim. Agatha and her husband Jack had moved to the property in 1962. They were young, recently married, burning with the blind optimism of people who believe hard work is enough to bend the world their way. They wanted children, but children did not come. Agatha wrote about this plainly, without self-pity. A year passed, then 2, then 5. They saw doctors in Hobart, but it seemed nothing was wrong with either of them. These things sometimes take time, they were told. But the time kept passing. In the winter of 1967, Agatha wrote about the basement for the first time. Jack had gone to Launceston for work, and she was alone in the house when she heard it. A sound from below the floor, from deep underneath the foundations. Her writings described it as something she felt in her teeth and her sternum before she ever heard it with her ears. Not quite a voice, more like the memory of a voice, the shape one leaves in the air after the sound has stopped. She went to the basement door and pressed her ear against it. Something was pressing back from the other side, listening to her, listening to it. She didn't go down that night, but she went back to the door the following evening, and the one after that. Within a week, she was sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the basement door for hours, feeling the vibration move through her spine and into her skull. The thing beneath the house was aware of her, and it was speaking. What followed in the journals was hard to read. Agatha's language became rambling and strange, full of half-finished thoughts and words that seemed invented rather than remembered. The thing beneath the house was old. Agatha didn't know what it was. She used different words for it. The tenant, the void, the foundation. It had been there before the house, before the farm, before any of it. It lived in the stone, the soil, the water table. It was patient in the way geology is patient, operating on a timescale that made human life look like the flare of a match. It offered her a deal. Nell read this passage 3 times while the dark pressed against the kitchen windows. Agatha's handwriting here was careful, deliberate, as if she had gone over it to make sure every word was exact. The thing would give her what she wanted. Fertility. A child. It had the ability to do this, the way soil has the ability to push a seed into a sapling. A matter of will, just a rearrangement of things that were already there. But it needed something in return. Not immediately, not even soon. It needed something that didn't exist yet. A child of that child, a grandchild. One life given into the world, one life returned to the dark. A symmetry. The words sat on the page like a stain. Agatha had agreed. After Jack returned from Launceston, they conceived within the month. 9 months later, Sarah was born. Agatha held her daughter and loved her with a ferocity she described as almost indistinguishable from terror. Nell put the journal down and pressed her fists against her eyes. Her mother, who had died at 31 from an aneurysm so sudden the paramedics said she was gone before her body hit the floor. Her mother, who had existed because of a deal struck in a farmhouse basement between a desperate woman and something that lived in the ground. And Nell herself, sitting in that same kitchen, breathing that same air. She existed because of it too. She was the debt. She was what was owed. She picked the journal up again. Agatha wrote that she spent the first years of Sarah's life pretending. She locked the basement and told Jack she was afraid of the dark space. He was a practical man who didn't ask questions about things that didn't concern him. Sarah grew up healthy, bright, and ordinary. Agatha watched her daughter thrive and tried to convince herself the deal had been a hallucination, a symptom of loneliness and grief. But the basement door stayed warm. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet, she could even feel a pulse in the floor, slow and steady, and she knew the thing was there, and it was waiting. Jack died in 1989, a heart attack over his morning tea. Sarah was 22 and already living in Melbourne. She came back for the funeral and told Agatha she'd met someone. Agatha smiled and felt the floor hum beneath her feet. When Sarah called to say she was pregnant, Agatha ran to the basement door. She beat on it with her fists until her knuckles split. She screamed at the thing below. She begged. She offered herself instead, her remaining years, whatever she had. The pulse beneath the floor didn't change. It simply continued, steady and indifferent. The deal was the deal. There was no renegotiation. Chapter 4. The Drawing. Nell was born in March of 1991. Agatha visited once, held her granddaughter, and did not visit again. And then Nell turned the page, and her breath stopped. In the margin of the journal, scratched in pencil so hard the paper had nearly torn, Agatha had drawn something. It was rough, barely more than a sketch. A figure standing beside what was clearly a cot. The figure was tall, too tall, and it had no features, no face, no hands, no detail of any kind. Agatha had filled it in completely. She had pressed the pencil down and scribbled back and forth until the figure was a solid black shape on the page. So dark, the graphite had a sheen to it. Beneath the drawing, in handwriting that shook, Agatha had written, "It came to see her. I thought she was screaming from a nightmare." It was standing over the cot, solid black, like a hole in the room. Nell's hands were trembling. She put the journal on the table and stared at the drawing as the kitchen dissolved around her, like she was somewhere else entirely. She was in her childhood bedroom in Melbourne. She was very young, young enough that the memory had no language attached to it, just sensation and image. And the image was this: a dark shape at the foot of her bed, a figure that was not a figure, a place where the room simply ended and something else began, something without light or dimension or texture, a void, standing motionless at the foot of her bed, and she was looking at it, the way a child looks at a nightlight or a teddy bear, without fear, without question, because it had always just been there. She had never known a night without it. It was in her room when she was 5 and afraid of storms. It was in the corner when she was 8 and reading under the covers with a torch. It was standing by the door when she was 12 and crying because the girls at school had decided she was no longer accepted in their circle of friends. Every night of her life, every single night, it was there. And she had never told anyone because there was nothing to tell. You don't tell people about the walls of your bedroom. You don't describe the ceiling. It was part of the architecture of her world, as ordinary and unremarkable as the dark itself. She hadn't stopped seeing it because she'd grown up. She'd stopped seeing it because you stop hearing a sound that never ceases. It becomes silence. It becomes nothing. but it was still there. Chapter 5. The Nursery. Nell stood up from the kitchen table. Her legs were shaking. She walked to the sink and looked out the window at the dead winter paddocks as she tried to breathe. Her whole life rearranged itself in front of her. The solitude she'd cultivated like a garden. The relationships she'd ended before they could settle. The distance she'd maintained from everyone and everything. She had always believed she was independent, self-sufficient, built for aloneness. But she hadn't been alone. Not once. Not ever. There had never been room for anyone else, because something was already there. It had always been there, standing in the dark of every room she'd ever slept in. She hadn't chosen solitude. She'd been occupied. She went upstairs to the nursery because she needed to see it, her mother's room. The cot was still there, the mobile of wooden birds hanging above it, still and dusty. The walls were soft yellow. Children's books lined a low shelf, their spines faded. Nell picked one up, a collection of fairy tales, the cover soft with handling. Inside, the front cover, in pencil, for Sarah, who was wished for. Agatha's handwriting. Nell pressed the book against her chest and sank to the floor. She cried. For her mother, who had lived her whole short life without knowing she was a transaction. For Agatha, who had known and carried it for decades. For herself, because she was beginning to understand. She hadn't come here to settle in a state. She had come because this was where she was always going to end up. Every road she'd ever taken led back to this house. Her whole life had been a long walk towards a door she was destined to open. The sound of her own sobbing filled the small room, until something else filled it too. A cold that started at the floor and rose. Not like a draft, but like a presence, displacing the air. Nell's breath stuttered. As she looked up, she could see the mobile was turning, steadily spinning, no wind. The wooden birds rotated in their slow circle, and standing beneath them, where a parent would stand to soothe a baby to sleep, was the void. It was exactly as Agatha had drawn it, exactly as Nell unknowingly remembered. A shape that was an absence of shape, a figure where light stopped and nothing began. It didn't have edges so much as boundaries, places where the room simply ceased to exist. It was tall enough that its upper margin nearly touched the mobile, and the birds turned through the space where its head should have been, vanishing and reappearing on the other side. Nell couldn't scream. Her body wouldn't let her. Every part of her had locked in place. Lungs, throat, jaw. She sat on the floor of the nursery, with the fairy tale book pressed against her chest, staring at the thing she had slept beside for the first 18 years of her life. Two responses existed in her simultaneously. The child, who recognized something as familiar as a lullaby, and the adult, who understood that what she was looking at was a hole in the fabric of everything, a wound in the world shaped like the thing that owned her. The mobile slowed. The void didn't move, standing over the empty cot. Nell felt its attention on her, the way you feel the sun on your face, a warmth that has nothing to do with heat and everything to do with focus. Then the cold receded. The air softened. The wooden birds stopped turning. The space beneath the mobile was empty. Nell got to her feet. She walked calmly downstairs, through the kitchen, and out the front door. Chapter 6. No escape. Crossing the yard, she got into her car, but her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 attempts to get the key into the ignition. When the engine turned over, she nearly cried with relief. She reversed down the gravel drive, hit the road, and drove. She drove for 20 minutes before she noticed the cold. The heater was running, but the temperature inside the car was dropping, as if someone had opened a window she couldn't find. She turned the heater up, but it made no difference. Her breath began to fog. She looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was dark. That was normal. It was night. There were no street lights out here. The road behind her was a strip of nothing between black paddocks. But the darkness in the back seat was wrong. It was too complete, too solid. The shape of the headrests, the line of the rear window, the texture of the upholstery, all of it was gone, swallowed by a dark that had depth and weight. She couldn't see where the seat ended and it began, because there was no seat anymore. There was just the void filling the space behind her, the way water fills a glass. She didn't turn around. She gripped the wheel and stared at the road, feeling it right behind her. Close enough that if it had breath, she would have felt it on the back of her neck. The cold in the car settled into her bones. The heater fan screamed on full, but pushed out nothing but frozen air. That's when Nell understood. It had never been just in the house. It was in the ground, and the ground was everywhere. There was nowhere she could drive, no city, no room, no distance that would put her beyond its reach. It had been with her in Melbourne. It had been with her every day of her life. The house was just where Agatha had first spoken to it. The basement was just a mouth. She slowed the car to a stop, sitting on the side of the road with the engine idling and the void sitting behind her. She thought about her options and found that she didn't have any. There was no running from something that existed beneath every surface she would ever stand on. She could fly to London. She could sail to Antarctica. And it would be there, in the ground below her, in the dark behind her, patient and present, just waiting for her to stop. She turned the car around and drove back to the farmhouse. The house received her without ceremony. She walked inside, and as she stood in the hallway, the air returned to its stale warmth. Only the soft pulse from behind the basement door persisted, steady and slow. She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her back to the basement door, watching the dark through the windows, waiting for the daylight. Morning seemingly took forever, the way it does when you are counting every second of its absence. She spent the next day cleaning. She told herself it was practical, that she was preparing the house for sale, so she scrubbed the kitchen, swept the floors, and beat the dust out of the curtains. The whole time, the basement door radiated heat, as the carved symbols pulsed with a faint dark luminescence that Nell refused to acknowledge. She cleaned the lounge room, the bathroom, and the spare bedrooms. She straightened the calendar on the wall, the one showing the month Agatha died, and looked at the small circle around the 14th. It wasn't the date of her grandmother's death. She understood that now. It was the date the last of Agatha's attempts to quell this tenant had failed. That evening she tried her phone. She'd been trying since she arrived, but but the signal was patchy at best. Inside the house, it was useless. She walked to the end of the drive and held the phone up, watching the bars flicker between 1 and nothing. She managed to send a text to her friend Lana. At the farm, sorting things, bad signal, talk soon, and then the screen went dark. She held the power button, then once again, but the screen was just a black mirror showing her own face, gaunt and unfamiliar. Chapter 7. The Final Journal. She spent the evening reading the final journal. The entries were sparse and confused. Agatha wrote about hearing Jack's voice in the basement, calling her name. She wrote about finding her own footprints in the dust on the basement stairs, but having no memory of going down there. She wrote, in a passage that made Nell's hands shake, that she had woken one night to find herself standing in front of Nell's childhood photograph on the mantelpiece. She was holding a kitchen knife. The last entry was 5 words. She must never come here. Nell closed the journal. The house was silent. The wind had stopped. Even the dripping she'd heard on the first night had ceased. The silence felt pressurized, like the air itself was holding its breath. She became aware of the warmth from the basement door. She could feel it from where she sat. The heat of a living body standing just out of sight. Beneath it a vibration so faint she might have imagined it. She felt it in her fillings, in the bones of her inner ear, in the soft tissue of her throat. She should leave. She knew this with a clarity that cut through everything. A clean, bright line that said, "Get in the car and drive without stopping. Sell the property from Melbourne and never think about this place again." But she had already tried leaving. She knew what was in the back seat. She knew what was under the road. There was no clean, bright line that led anywhere it wasn't. She went upstairs and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The floor hummed beneath the mattress like a living thing. Later she dreamed she was in the basement. Standing on the stone floor in perfect darkness, the air was warm and thick and tasted of iron and salt. Something was there with her. She couldn't see it. She didn't need to. It engulfed the space. And it was aware of her the way the earth is aware of a seed, intimately, possessively, with patience that had no end. It was glad she had come. It had been waiting. It had felt her when she was conceived, a distant spark in the cold vastness of its attention, and it had been present for every moment since. A frequency below hearing but constant, threaded through her life like a bass note beneath a melody she thought was silence. She woke on the basement stairs. She was standing 6 steps down, bare feet, dark. The padlock was in her hand, open. She didn't remember picking it up. She didn't remember finding a key. The basement door behind her was wide open, and the heat pouring up from below was immense. The symbols on the doorframe had gone dark, extinguished, dead. She could hear it, not just feel it, but hear it. A sound like something vast, finally exhaling after holding its breath for 30 years. Nell climbed back up the stairs. She closed the door. The padlock in her hand was fused. The shackle melted into the body as if exposed to tremendous heat. A single solid lump of metal that would never open or close again. Standing in the kitchen, she came to the understanding that these things didn't matter. Locks, doors, the symbols carved into every frame and threshold were all completely irrelevant. You can't lock a door that something doesn't use. You can't protect against something that is already inside. Agatha had spent 30 years building an empty cage, while the void was standing at the foot of Nell's bed, watching her breathe. On the fourth night, she didn't fight it. She walked through the kitchen, past the open basement door, and descended the stairs in the dark, her bare feet on cold stone. With each step down, the temperature rose and the air thickened. The pulse intensified until it was indistinguishable from her own heartbeat, until she couldn't tell where her blood ended and the sound began. The stairs went down further than any foundation required, through layers of stone and clay and something older, something dense and warm and faintly luminous, with a light that didn't illuminate but revealed, the way lightning reveals a landscape for a single frame. Everything visible, nothing comprehensible. The walls were covered in the same symbols Agatha had carved upstairs, but these weren't scratched into the surface. They were part of the stone, raised and smooth. At the bottom, there was a chamber, circular, the ceiling lost in darkness. The floor was not stone, but earth, and it smelled of roots and minerals. But there was something beneath those smells that was alive, in a way soil is not. The void was there. She could see it now, because there was nothing else to see. It filled the chamber, the way it had filled her childhood bedroom, the way it had filled the back seat of her car, the way it had stood beneath the mobile and watched the wooden birds turn. It was the walls and the floor and the air and the warmth. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a being in any way she could frame. It was the thing that makes roots push through stone, makes the dead become the living, and the living become the dead. It was the engine of the cycle, and it was owed. She felt it move through her, not painfully, but completely, like water moving through sand, filling every space and gap and hollow. Her skin prickled, her vision dimmed. She felt herself becoming less distinct, her edges softening, her boundaries dissolving. She was being taken into the earth, the way the earth takes everything. Slowly, gently, inevitably. Nell tried to speak, and found she couldn't. Not because anything was stopping her, but because there was no longer enough of her to form words. Her thoughts thinned and diffused. She could feel the roots of the oaks above, 100 thread-like pathways, drawing water up from the dark. She could feel the weight of the house, every beam, every nail and pane of glass. She could feel Agatha's old carvings, scratched into the frames, still faintly warm with the residue of decades of desperate faith. And she could feel how fragile they had always been against something this vast. The last thing she felt was the pulse. It moved through what remained of her, and she understood it completely. The way you understand a word you've been mispronouncing your whole life when you finally hear it spoken right. It wasn't a sound. It was a heartbeat, and she was inside it now, folded into the dark, warm body of the thing beneath the house, and the debt was paid. Chapter 8. A New Beginning. Above, in the kitchen, the basement door swung shut. The symbols on the frame flickered once and went dark. The house settled into its foundations, with a sound like a sigh. The warmth that had radiated from the basement door for 60 years faded until the wood was cold to the touch. Nell's car sat in the driveway. Her bag sat in the hallway. Her jacket hung on the rack beside Agatha's old coats. In a few weeks, the solicitor would call, and when no one answered, he would drive out and find the house empty and the car dead with no sign of anything. He would file a missing persons report. Police would search the property and find nothing. An old woman's belongings, a basement door they couldn't open, and no reason to force it. The house would sit on the market for years. The price would drop. Eventually, someone would buy it. A young couple perhaps, drawn by the cheap acreage and the solid bones of the old place. They would move in, sand the floors, paint the walls, tear out the kitchen, without ever noticing the symbols carved into the door frames, until the builder asked about them. By then, it wouldn't matter. The thing beneath would already know they were there. Perhaps already negotiating the next contract with the woman of the house.